And I just want to talk a little bit about putting this in context of some of the stuff we're dealing with for those watching at home. You know, we're roughly halfway through a 2-year process here. We've had a lot of testimony in multiple committees, education, finance, two main ones dealing with education, dealing with the funding, the performance of our children over time, and the interrelationships that may appear or highly correlated or non-correlated between the funding and the performance. Clearly, over the last several years, it's hard to argue that we haven't been affected by the inflation cycle, particularly in the last couple of years. We knew it last year on the floor of the Senate here when we were talking about this very same issue, funding our schools. Some of us supported BSA increases last year. I was one of them. And the BSA was funded, base student allocation was funded outside of the budget, similar to the proposals this year, outside the budget, except this piece of legislation would instill it in the base amount. So when we look at flat funding for several years, or holding the BSA flat, and then some marginal funding outside, and you look at the impacts of inflation, regardless if you agree that the schools are near perfect or totally dysfunctional, we've got to address the funding level. And we spent a lot of time this year looking at the impacts of the COVID money in schools. We can't even get a good feel, an accurate feel for the cash positions of our school districts, all of them across the board. And we were requesting additional information from them. So next session we have that in front of us. So this is a stopgap measure. This isn't the final solution. And to give the folks at home just an idea what we're talking about, the base number is 1.56 billion, 1.56 billion. We added 57 million to that last year for about a 5% increase. This year, we start with the same base number, and we're going to add 174 million, or a marginal difference of 117 over last year, 117 million. I don't know next year if we'll have another BSA increase sitting here on the floor. It depends on the numbers and the analysis that come back from our districts and get through DEED. So the Department of Education, when we ask them a simple question, are our schools adequately funded? Is Anchorage? Is Juneau? Is Kenai? You know, pick your school across the state. You know, they can't give us a straight answer, and that's what we're trying to figure out here. We know they need funding. This, over the base, all districts, is about a 15% increase. And that's the first in several years. So it's pretty hard to argue that we don't need to increase the funding to the schools. It doesn't solve the performance issue. We're going to continue working on that from multiple angles. It doesn't, it helps, but it doesn't solve the retention issue of our educators, our housing issues of our educators, our fuel costs of our schools, our maintenance costs of our schools. You know, this is just a cornerstone of a building block over a 2-year process to stabilize our schools, and as we work collectively together to get our education performance up. And we have dropped over the last few years with COVID lower than historically we've been. There's no doubt about that. So, Mr. President, you know, over the base, the North Slope Borough would get a 22% increase. The bottom school, Southeast Island School District, is 11.4. But it goes through a formula that is fair, passes the federal tests, and most of the districts are hovering in around the 13, 14, 15% increase. I think it's needed, Mr. President. It's part of a building block. We need to get some funds to our schools. We'll come back next winter, continue to work on education, and hopefully when we wrap up a year from now, the schools will be in much better financial position than they are, and they'll be better positioned also to increase test scores which is the underlying goal that we're trying to accomplish. So the next generation of Alaskans are as good off or better off, preferably better off than we were.